Hello and welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host, and today I bring you Adele Getty on the podcast. She is a fantastic teacher. I read her book, A Sense of the Sacred. This fantastic read, A Sense of the Sacred, Finding Our Spiritual Lives Through Ceremony. And I've had Adele as I've desired to have Adele on the show for a long time. So to bring her here to you now, it gives me a great sense of joy. And I want to give you a couple updates and let you know about a project she's got going on, and then I'll get to the episode. So first of all, of course, please sign up for the newsletter at drjohnwprice.com, drjohnwprice.com, and you will be getting 2 newsletters per month, but all things going on here. And please also, while you're on the website, check out the Open Gate group I'm hosting every month, where we are traveling through what I call the little teachers. Essentially, it's an exploration of the archetypes that we call emotions, these embodied, autonomous experiences that take us over at times. And most of us tend to not really know how to engage, how to connect with, how to be with those emotional experiences. Most of us have learned how to distract from, to disconnect from, and to shut down. As Freud or Jung would have it, we have defense mechanisms to manage these. They are called denial, repression, suppression, repression, projection, and many others. So please, come on. I invite you in to come into that group. We meet once a month and go through a little teacher each month. This month, I will teach to spiritual practice. If you'll look for the solo episode where I'm teaching about spiritual practice, the what of spiritual practice. And then online, I will have a course, which is the how of spiritual practice. So lots coming on here, many things going on. Stay tuned for more developments, more growth, more exciting times. Thank you for being here. Now, I would like to share with you a website for the Limina Foundation, Limina Foundation, FOUNDATION.org. It's exploring New Mexico's psychedelic futures. And I would like so Adele Getty is, first of all, one of the creators of this incredible community. Adele is a pioneering voice in psychedelic education, known for decades of work exploring the sacred, culture, and psychological dimensions of psychedelic healing. A founding member of the Guild of Guides, she's helped shape the field of assisted psychedelic work with deep integrity and cross-cultural wisdom. Her books include A Sense of the Sacred and Goddess, Mother of Living Nature. They explore ceremony, matrifocal history, and rites of passage. Widely respected as an elder and wisdom keeper, her recent keynote at the 2023 MAPS conference received a standing ovation. Adele's work continues to guide a deeper, more grounded psychedelic future. Adele, fantastic to have you on the show. Thank you for being here. Check out Limina Foundation. She'll let you know at the very end about a conference that's coming up in September in Santa Fe. But for now, one note, we at the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences, a boutique integrative wellness center here in Houston, are hiring. We're looking for Jungian analysts. If you know any Jungian analysts out there in the world, please send them over to us. Let them know that we are looking to create, they can be anywhere in the world. We are looking to create to further expand our offerings at the center. And check us out at thecenterforhas.com. And now we'll leave it there. Thanks for being here.
Controls your dream, persuades your thoughts.
First of all, as we were just kind of saying, your book, A Sense of the Sacred, feels like a doorway, and it feels so current. So though it's nearly written almost 30 years ago, it could have emerged yesterday or tomorrow. And in this moment of spiritual hunger and ecological collapse, all of our world, and certainly your words, feel prophetic and tender. And so what you describe isn't just theory, it's an invitation back into this living world, a world where trees are kin and rivers are teachers and grief is a sacred guide. You write from a place of anthropology, theology, poetry, and ritual. But what struck me most about your book is the tone. It's this lament and love song. And I want to explore not just your ideas today, but your experience. Certainly, I mean, given that it's almost 30 years ago, certainly what has happened since, of course, what led you to write this book and what, of course, has changed since writing the book. And I propose we take your invitation and begin where you began, in the old world, in the world of animism. But before we do that, because I do think, as you said earlier, your first probably 3 chapters just hit me right between the eyes, and it rattled me so much. I love where you started it, and so just to start today, right? What brings you to this conversation that we're having? Why do you feel this conversation about the sacred is so important? And then we'll kind of work from there.
Yeah, well, I was motivated to write that book at that time because I just felt as a culture we were and continue to struggle, specifically I think around rites of passage.
Mhm.
As Joseph Campbell said, if you want to see the impact of the lack of proper initiations, you can read the headlines of the newspapers.
Mhm.
And that we we've lost our connection to I think the sacred. One of the things that I was also looking through the book, even though it was 30 years ago, and I saw this one line that I wrote that there's a way to look forward when we think about the sacred, and that fundamentalism is basically looking to the past.
Mhm.
And it's like, how do we as modern people find our way into more meaningful rites of passage,
Mhm.
more meaningful initiation ceremonies for the teenagers? Because if we don't initiate them, they will initiate one another. And that's what gangs do, and that's what prison does, and that's what tattoos and piercing and all of that is their way, and people's way of trying to find a way to go through something, and
Yeah.
all good initiations have an ordeal associated with them, and whether it's a vision quest or a Sundance, but I think we've lost a lot of the meaning in like in organized religion, for instance, confirmation or bar mitzvah. It doesn't really. There is no real change in status that's
Mhm.
acknowledged. Proper initiation recognizes a change in status. And so it was things like that I was observing back then, because the children were coming of age, and it was like, what do we do with them? How do we do something? How do we create something? And I think, the book was driven partially by that, and partially by a deep ecology viewpoint that I had as part of my background in environmental science of, how do we, as at one point I talk about, we're like an exotic species that has been transplanted to this
Mhm.
continent, and what happens to a species? How does a species go native? What does that mean for us? How do we begin to inhabit our place here in a more sacred way, rather than in the way that we have just kind of run rampant across this whole continent over the last, few hundred years.
Well, thanks for going there. Thank you. And really, thank you for your time here today. I'm so, you and I've been around each other a number of times now, and to be able to get to know you in this way is a real gift.
Yeah.
So I know I said animism earlier, but I want to go somewhere else right now. You mentioned your background. I'm curious if you would introduce yourself to our audience. Let us know who you are.
My name's Adele Getty, and I'm the director of the Lament Foundation, a nonprofit that supports moving both the psychedelic space forward and anything that concerns itself with consciousness and
Mm.
expanding consciousness in a way that is beneficial to people and culture, society, the planet. And my background is in environmental science and psychology. and some anthropology as well, and just a lifelong interest in multidisciplinary, bigger picture pattern thinking.
Yeah, you can tell when you read your book.
Yeah.
It's evident. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so rich is how you draw from anthropology. So, just curiously, when you got into environmental sciences, what drew you to that?
What drew me to that was I was a kid when Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring came out. And that book was written, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. She came from a neighboring town. It was quite ecologically devastated because of the mills and factories and whatnot. So I had an early interest both in the environment and a very early just love of nature, love of playing in the fields, running through the woods, building little cabins down in the woods with all the kids in the neighborhood, that kind of thing. So, and as I matured and, went through high school and into college, it was the beginning of the environmental movement and people like Bucky Fuller and Marshall McLuhan and, Theodore Roszak. And there were so many writings coming out at that point that I was drawn, into wanting to have an environmental viewpoint on what was happening.
Yeah, I wish more people did that.
Yeah,
Uh,
we can't even talk about climate change now in
yeah,
certain places,
yeah, yeah. I have so many ideas. I don't want to go too far ahead too soon, but I have all kinds of jumping in points. Let's begin where you began in this. That seems understandable given your interest in ecology and environmental sciences, and when we look at the more spiritual or religious world view, this word animism you put at the forefront of your book, which I of course love. So let's set that stage a little bit for folks. What is animism?
Well, it's an interesting word. Who first used the word? It was one of the early anthropologists, and I'm not placing his name,
Yeah, you said it in
but
the book. Yeah.
he wanted to use the word spiritualism, but it had already been like co-opted by like the Fox sisters, in New York, who were doing like table knocking
Seances and yeah,
seances
sure.
and all of that. So he used the word animism instead. And I think it's what we as human beings on this planet have done in the long history of our lives and of our evolution up until really a few thousand years ago, or even up until like a few hundred years ago. And it's the thing that every indigenous culture represents around the world, where they experience themselves embedded as part of a living system. They experience their ancestors. They experience the plants in relationship to them. Maybe the plants are teaching them. The animals are connected to them. Their kinships and clans and as I said in the book, there's families, who still have the name wolf or hawk or, plant names. And this is part of our heritage, as human beings. And it's also been in relationship to these indigenous cultures around the world, whether it's Africa, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, South America, Australia, North America. It's this, when the Western mind comes into contact with them, they want to eliminate that view. I'm not quite sure, why it seems to be like so threatening to the what has become like the modern mind. We view them as being superstitious. We view them, in a variety of ways. But it's probably been the biggest, acts of genocide against Native peoples, and Native peoples everywhere have this same belief that the earth is alive. There is a relationship, whether it's with the rocks, with the air, with the birds, with the animals, with the plants. And we kind of view that as like this, oh, isn't that quaint? We don't quite get it, except occasionally, something might bring us to it. Maybe a psychedelic experience, brings us to that, or the ayahuasca, for instance, or just an experience in nature ourselves where suddenly we feel like, we are not only connected with it, but part of it, not separate from, but actually a living part of a much larger living system that seems to be imbued with some kind of consciousness.
Mm. Yeah, I lament that certainly on a lot of levels. I did not, I grew up with fantasies of that because I was somewhat influenced by some of the native traditions in and around Texas and Oklahoma. And so this weird, it was foreign to me, this idea of a deep relationship with nature and with community. And you make this point a lot in your book is that we don't have I think one of the reasons why somebody goes to have a psychedelic experience and they have this really powerful, deeply connective, mystical experience, whatever we want to call it, but then they don't have the communal structure around them to support that as a valid, experience that diminishes, and we get swept back up into the routines and norms of existence of our previous life before we had that experience.
Right. Yeah.
I had this fantasy about you sharing some stories about your experiences in maybe with folks that have an animistic worldview. What stands out as moments where you felt influenced by cultures that were not so extractive but more connected to nature?
Yeah, I think in my 20s, I had the opportunity to have a number of Native American teachers. And I feel very lucky in how they were instructing me because it was a time, it was a time when, for instance, the little bumper sticker, the earth is our mother.
Mm.
Um, that was a new concept. As a culture, circa 1970, that was not new to the native mind,
Uh-huh.
but that was new to the Western mind, that the earth is our mother. And that was a very common kind of bumper sticker that I saw in California. And I know the teacher, the Native American teacher who initiated that was a man named Sun Bear. And Sun Bear had a community of a mixed community of, white people and Indians, and they lived in a kind of collective communal situation. They grew food and they taught. And they were teaching the outside world, the Western world, the modern world, these concepts like, yes, the earth is our mother. And they also were teaching a system called the medicine wheel system.
Mm.
And the medicine wheel system is a circular map. It's not a linear system that goes across the page this way, but it's a circle. And so those kinds of ideas start to shift, how you think. And so, like in a basic medicine wheel, you would have the four cardinal directions of, north, south, east, and west. And each of those directions would represent an element like earth, water, fire, and air. And then each of those directions would represent an animal that, had to, and an emotional part of our body. So the fire element would represent the spirit. The water element would represent our emotional body. The earth element would represent our physical, the material plane. The air element would represent our mental capacity or the logos, like more of an informed mind. So they were maps of consciousness that layered information. And then there would be positions in the non-cardinal directions, between the north and the east, between the east and the south and the west and the north. So those early maps like that were very instructive to me, and I think began to like shift how I thought. And then I also there were a number of indigenous teachers, and I would say they were all like rogues, um, in the sense that they were willing to teach non-native people these teachings, which meant they also got, critiqued by other indigenous people for, daring to do this. But what was interesting to me as I encountered a number of them, and like Sun Bear, he would put on these medicine wheel gatherings around the country. And I actually was part of organizing several of them in the Bay Area in California. And we would have like 1,000 people for a weekend, who would come. And there would be a variety of teachers, both Indian, Native American, and Western, teachers in like the human potential movement, who were teaching things about this more animistic worldview. And as part of the gathering, it was always so much fun. We would build a big medicine wheel, and people would have costumes, so the bear spirit would place the rock that represented that direction, on the medicine wheel, and the deer spirit or the eagle spirit, would do that. And people would get to inhabit what that animal might be or what that emotion might be, and to create a medicine wheel. And a lot of places and retreats, as a result of this, actually would build, medicine wheels on their land, as a result of it. And of course, the point was to be in the center of your will. So to be able to be in the center and be able to access, the spiritual nature of yourself, the emotional body of yourself, the mental, the physical, and understand what it means to be like in harmony and balance. How do we keep those energies in balance as we walk through our life?
Oof.
I know that was a lot.
Good question. I'm with you. Well, but it brings up you mentioned it earlier about going native. And, I had that in my experience. I think that if I reflect on my life, I had this desire to be in communion with community and spirit. And the ways that I had to do that were not very in relationship to the spirit. I certainly had opportunities to connect with community. I had very social religion, but as I grew and developed, I had that, "Oh, I need to go native," which was probably more of an appropriation, getting involved in a culture that wasn't necessarily my own. And
Right.
you reference this in the book about feeling adrift, feeling like a people without lineage, without the ancestors and without the stories. How do we rejoin the living world with integrity? And I think your book certainly is getting at that. So I want to just open that
Yeah.
further question up.
Yeah. Well, I think, what was so kind of interesting for me with the variety of teachers that I had back then. It was like I was in my 20s at that point. None of them wanted me to be an Indian. And it was like, oh, thank you so much, But they wanted these teachings to find a way into contemporary culture. And uh, at one point, I remember I met a man named Reuben Snake, who he's passed on, and he was the president of the Native American Church, and that's a peyote church. That at that point, I think that was like 200,000. Native American Church is about 500,000 people now.
Wow.
And Reuben he was a wonderful, wonderful man, family man. And after he passed, he really is held almost, he's held like a saint in that, bigger community. But at one point I was asking him, like what do we do as modern people? How do we start to develop, a sense of the sacred and community? And he very quickly he responded and he said, the first thing you need to do is get your songs together. And he wasn't talking about, Spotify or, Apple Music, or a playlist, but he was talking about, you know, uh, uh, chant songs from the spirit. And so I had been working inside a system of chants and songs and kind of improv, allowing that to happen. So I sang him, a couple of little chants, and he was like, oh, those are from the spirit.
Mm.
And I think, that that's kind of basic, a basic element in ceremony all around the planet, whether you're in a cathedral
Mm.
or around the fire, that, there is this mm, the impulse for human beings to sing, to chant, to drum, to rattle, and no one culture owns that. And,
Mhm.
it's part of our heritage. And I always like to remind people that whoever you are, no matter how urbanized you might be for generations or wherever you come from, if you go back far enough, you will find a spiritual element in your lineage. You will find midwife, herbalists, healers, people who were connected to the land somewhere. It might be 100 years ago, or it might be 600 years ago, but there will be that inside our lineage. And it's like, how do we begin to activate that and recognize it and honor it? And I heard this African medicine man say that why would I want to silence the voices inside my head? Those are my ancestors talking to me, in relationship to kind of Western psychology and
Yeah.
how it is actually colonizing the minds of people in very different cultures who have very different worldviews than we do, whether it's Africa or Brazil or, deep in the Amazon. And I love that he was able to say that, rather than have it become a diagnosable illness.
Yeah. Oh, isn't that the truth? It's a problem. I mean, it's my world, and I can critique psychotherapy a lot, and in fact think that there are a lot of psychotherapies that, as you are saying, are part of the problem and prevent people from listening to a deeper, what Jung would call, the collective unconscious or the ancestors. That we're
Mm-hmm.
shutting ourselves off from a relationship, and wonder why we're consistently spending so much energy consuming outer world activities.
Yeah, and I think, again, we tend to think of these things as being, kind of charming metaphors
Yeah.
rather than the reality is that, a large portion of the people on the planet, certainly in South America, Africa, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, these are living realities for them. Bali, for instance. And we've been disconnected from that. And of course, I can go back, and I did go back to, Descartes and, Francis Bacon, and that kind of split that happened with
Mhm.
the machine world,
Mhm.
coming into being, and the Industrial Revolution, in particular, and the kind of upset that created, and the wonders of it that it created, the comforts that
Sure.
it created for all of us. And at the same time, so much was kind of broken at that same moment.
Well, and it's a great setup for this next question. But before we get to the next question, I have an invitation because I found myself very curious what songs you might be referring to. Do you ever sing in public, Adele?
Do I ever sing in public?
Yeah, what
Uh,
are these songs? What are spirit songs? I mean, I'm well aware, but for anybody that doesn't, what is that? A spirit song?
let's see. Well, I used to sing this to when I would pick my granddaughter up from school from first grade, and we would be in the car. We would sing, and so let's see. Do you want me to actually
I would
sing one?
love, yes, absolutely. I just make your face red and put you on the spot.
Great. Okay, so we would sing this little song. The earth is our mother. I must take care of her. The earth is our mother. I must take care of her.
Mm.
Hey, young, oh, young, hey, young, young. Hey, young, oh, young, hey, young, young. Her sacred ground we walk upon. With every step we take, her sacred ground we walk upon. With every step we take. Hey, young, oh, young, hey, young, young. Hey, young, oh, young, hey, young, young. Very simple.
Beautiful. Thank you. What a peek into a beautiful world.
And so I was part of a group thanks to a a professor by the name of Robert Greenway, and he initiated a lot of people in wilderness programs
Mm,
into a variety of ceremony and all night ceremony. And in the all night ceremony, it was very much an equal opportunity event in that everybody in the ceremony had the opportunity to share 4 times during the night. And you could share whatever was in your heart, where you were, pretty much at that moment. But you could not talk it. You had to sing it. And so it was an all night singing prayer. And out of that ceremony, which it's continued like almost 50 years on. Many, many people have participated in that. And out of that, many songs were brought through.
mm,
And that kind of song that I just sang would be like one like simple,
mhm,
simple song, but it was a way that people would actually, like learn how to pray in their own voice, learn
mhm,
how to pray from their authentic self, learn how to ask for help, learn how to communicate with the forces of nature, whether it was because there was a drought and calling in that, calling in rain and feeling connected. And in those ceremonies, the rest of the group would become like a Greek chorus,
mhm,
in the sense that they could pick up a refrain, hey, young, oh, young, and this thing would happen, with it. And it was a very powerful way, to connect and create community.
mhm,
um, uh, there were elemental, around the fire, drums, rattles, guitar, musical instruments, ceremonial moments in it, with the different elements of earth and water and, all of that. And so, large numbers of people could participate, in that. And I think one of the most powerful aspects of all of that was that people got to be witnessed,
mhm,
and I could we could all realize the power of healing when people just get to be witnessed
mhm,
by other people, and depth of connection that happens as a result of that kind of vulnerability and witnessing that takes place. And without it turning into any kind of dogma or particular belief system, but a willingness to be open to, kind of magic, the magic of the owl that hoots at the coyote that howls outside the circle at a particular moment, or, the way the wind comes in, or just having a sense of like, oh, I'm actually like interacting and being interacted with something that's,
Totally. Thank you for singing. Yeah, it gets to this question, which is where did the severing happen? Where did our, I would say, kind of the Western mind? You mentioned Descartes, but I'm a little suspicious it happened earlier than that. Like, what
Oh
do you
yeah.
think? What do you think are the forces that contributed to this severing?
I think we have to go back to, if we're going to really go back, we go back to early agriculture and the domestication of animals, because it's at that point where after, what, a million years, hundreds of thousands of years, certainly as hunters and gatherers, that for the first time we have a surplus, and that surplus means that for the first time there's a segment of the population who's no longer engaged in the day-to-day realities of existing. Their job is now to monitor the surplus and to start recording the surplus, maybe with X's, and it's the beginning of a bureaucratic actual priest caste that emerges that does that, cross culturally. When we look at early agriculture, whether it's Hasselaar or Gobek, well, not so sure about Gobekli Tepe, but Catalhuyuk or Mohenjo-Daro, these, we're talking eight, 9,000 years ago. The domestication of animals, very big moment. The being able to realize that if you have cattle, cows or cattle, all or goats, all the males except a few or one need to be castrated. You were going to choose that breeding, the capacity of that. And I think that and then of course the surplus, if you're doing, large scale, of course, these early agricultural communities, Mohenjo-Daro, Mohenjo-Daro is in India, Catalhuyuk and Hasselaar in Turkey. They're the ones that we probably know the most about in terms of excavations, but they existed oftentimes for 1,000 years without any sign of warfare. They were pretty complex systems. They had sewage systems, burial chambers, lots of paintings, a lot of kind of female figures, and also a lot of the masculine too. It would be like the feminine, these big Venus figures, for instance, or bulls and horns. And so, some kind of balance was happening, between like what we would look at as being feminine or masculine, energies, that there seemed to be some kind of balance. But then, when you have a surplus, it becomes obvious to the people who are not doing agriculture that, no, if we show up there in September when the crops are being harvested, we can just raid those, and take away the surplus. So then you start to have large scale architecture and fortified, walled developments in order to protect the surplus that's being created. And now maybe you have a whole farming caste of people who are farming for the community at large, and other, maybe more specialized people in the community who are not engaged in the farming activity. And then out of that kind of organization, you start to have an army that is going to defend, and then it begins, right?
Wow. Yeah. Running our own program. There's I like AA a lot. The spiritual steps, these steps that AA provides, and
Yeah,
one of the first steps is, of course, surrendering your will over to a higher
power.
power. And people really, I think, misunderstand that because, of course, we don't understand the Christianity in a lot of ways. But I see that where we try to assert our own will over, and many would actually call this black magic. This black magic being trying to bend reality to my own will, to shape it into my own image, is kind of contrary to the natural flow of things.
Yes, yeah.
Mm. So, so then we've got people congregating, and then we have stories that are shared. And you write about, in Burning the Garden, you write about the loss of myth and ceremony. And how do
Mm.
you see this playing out in modern times? The loss of myth.
Well, it's just, well, I think we're constantly creating new myths, and but it 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 seems like the AI, it's like the myth
The
of
new one.
the new one,
Yeah.
right? And I think the sad part of where we are right now, with our technology, is the isolation that many people feel. Where, even inside families, and, being at the dinner table, or, just uh, being able to, like, be in the company of other people and have a conversation, and not be constantly looking at our iPhone, and so there's something, that I think we're losing, in terms of our human connection with one another. That And I think, that's part of the role of what organized religion, is able to do, and be able to go to your church or your synagogue and be in the company of other people, or retreats, or
Hmm.
whatever that might be. That impulse, we still want to do that. We want to have that human connection, and I hope we don't lose that.
Hmm.
And I think, if we can, I look at the popularity of like our national parks. It's such a strong impulse, right? To want to go and visit, and, even be so naive that you think you can walk up to a wild buffalo, and end up, on the news as
Yes.
a result, like, there is a certain naivete, right, that has developed where, do we think it is all Disneyland,
Mhm.
there, and that, these creatures, we go there to see them, and, like, how do we, actually honor them without endangering ourselves or them as a result of us being, naive in that way?
Yeah, you earlier mentioned, I think one kind of element of this conversation I want to bring in. You were mentioning your nonprofit and psychedelics, and I'm curious, as you were drawing this kind of historical analysis of the birth of agriculture, and where does psychedelics fit into this narrative?
Well, of course, whether you're looking at the Amazon basin, and ayahuasca, and Africa, and the Fang people, or the Ibogaine, or in North America, the peyote, and the Huichol Indians, Soma coming out of India, and being written in the Vedic, books. And clearly people have always looked to like alter their consciousness, whether it's with, wine or certain herbs and plants and, all of that. And then, well, I find it really interesting. I don't want to just talk about like plant spirits and the plant medicine. I also want to talk about molecules and acknowledge a quick little part of my story. When I was 7 years old, at 1957, we received all these magazines. I was precocious. I was a reader. And the one magazine that came in was it was a Life magazine, all about Gordon Wasson going to Huautla and finding Maria Sabina and doing this ceremony. As a 7-year-old, all I saw was magic mushrooms, an Indian woman, fire and smoke and healing and ceremony. As a 7-year-old, that was like, what is that? And it's that magazine. I actually have an original copy of it that a friend gifted me. And so I was able to like relook at it in the last couple of years. And it's like, what attracted me as a 7-year-old? And I never forgot about it, but it was like those words, magic, healer, ceremony, Indian woman, the visuals of it, all of it. But, I think to, Albert Hoffman going back and re-looking at the LSD molecule. That was 1945. And I look at that kind of historically and I go, how interesting, within 2 weeks of the same time period that the Manhattan Project was completed, that he had his first, accidental bicycle ride, with LSD at the same time where this giant mushroom cloud with the Manhattan Project and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And how is that a coincidence that molecule was discovered at the same moment? And then, it went on for up until 1965 with at least 1,000 scientific papers written on the effects of, LSD on the mind and on all kinds of, psychological conditions for human beings. And I think, my generation that was born and conceived after World War II, we were born and conceived under that, under this giant mushroom cloud. And, we had the strontium 90 in our mother's milk, as do all future babies and milk, and whether it's the cow's milk or your mother's breast. And I've always found it interesting that, we also, that generation, came of age in the 60s, and that idea of like the summer of love that happened, and the Harvard, Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner and, Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, the Vietnam War, the assassinations of Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, all of these things kind of dovetailed, into that moment where psychedelics exploded, around the world. And was that just a crazy coincidence that we all were conceived post-nuclear, post-LSD of Albert Hoffman? I mean, I think there's something more than coincidence there.
Yeah.
And then we have, Gordon Wasson in the 50s going down and finding the magic mushrooms and getting some of that to Albert Hoffman, who was able to find out what the active ingredient was. And we already, 100 years before that, we have, anthropologist Mooney looking at peyote use with the Native Americans, and we have early reports of ayahuasca in the 30s where they're calling it telepathine.
Mhm.
as telepathic. And so suddenly now the Western mind is like, oh, we should look at these substances, and the youth at that point, in the 60s and 70s, really experimenting and, recklessly and intelligently and trying to find, a way to integrate them into their life. And I think the psychedelics were, the 60s, the hippie movement, the summer of love, all that. We could say, oh, kind of fizzled, failed,
Mhm.
but did it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, it brings up the question around. I just had this curiosity about how we're going about psychedelics. It seems to me that based on what we're saying, with its, we start in this worldview of animism, and we're saying, well, the kind of Western mind doesn't really have that. We're not participating. In fact, we've pulled ourselves out of nature to observe it as an outsider,
Mm,
and then we take this powerful compound or substance, molecule or whatever, in whatever form it comes, and have these radical experiences that tend to connect us with all things, and elegantly simple, and they all inspire a degree of love or presence or connection, or feel like we're communing with some kind of
yeah.
other, and then we don't know what to do with that. I'm curious if we move in now to some of your work regarding ceremony and the sacred, and talk about, because you use this line in your book about becoming a modern day rite maker.
Mm.
And so I'm as if we can blend all this energy together a little bit: modern day psychedelics, worldviews, religious and otherwise, and then rites and ritual in the modern container. What comes up for you there?
Well, I think, we're like children, and it's okay,
Yeah.
to be like that, and to, uh, I often liken it to, like, okay, I'm going to go outside and I'm going to talk to that tree out there. And it's like, well, you haven't talked to that tree ever before. And what, you want the tree to, like, communicate back with you right away? It's like we need to cultivate the relationship with the natural world. We need
Mm,
to, we start off kind of play acting. We start off like with pageantry in our ceremonies, but we can slowly deepen that, into more real relationship, where if you're lucky enough to live where you do have trees and birds, you can recognize that, oh, I get to know that bunny that's in my yard, and I see him every morning when I go out there. And as time goes by, he used to run completely away and out the gate. Now he just hops a little bit away, and because he knows me now, and I know him, and I actually do have a bunny in my yard. And I say hello to him, and I think that, these, like, simple acts of just beginning to embrace and communicate with nature. And it's like any friendship. If you haven't talked to that person ever in your life, they're not going to suddenly become your best friend. But if you persist in paying attention, to whatever bits of nature you might have around you, or the birds or the ravens or the hawk, that flies by, or, whatever it might be. I think, it's a beginning. And then, there are elements of ceremony, I think, that are, really important. And I think, like with psychedelics, if we go back to that, it's like, how do we create sacred ways of engaging with these substances that aren't just us mirroring and learning how to sing like a Lakota, or, taking on the ways of indigenous culture, because, yes, we can talk about cultural appropriation, but I think that, there's also cultural appreciation, and, that we can appreciate what these cultures offer
mm,
us, and we don't have to mimic them, we can find ways to begin to create in our own, communities, ways of creating things that become meaningful for us as modern people in our own voices and in our own way of praying with maybe our own songs, with where we get to trust in the authenticity of our own experience without a mediator, without a guru, without the medicine man, without that person.
So immediately I went into something you noted in the book I thought really well was the embarrassment, and how when you work with folks, whether it's to pray or to sing or to whatever it is they're doing, even to celebrate, to be reverent, there's an embarrassment. And I think your reference to kind of play acting, it almost means like we're play acting along with our collective terror of implicating ourselves in the world in a way that makes us stand out as potentially foolish. So how do you work with folks through that process of embarrassment, or how did you work through yours?
Well, I think, I feel I did feel lucky to have, these teachers who didn't want me to like become that.
Yeah.
They wanted me to do something else.
Mm.
So that was a plus. And sometimes it just is pageantry, and you feel like, when you were in first grade and you put on a little play with your friends in the backyard and march around or, whatever. But then, there's more meaningful ways to have people, drop in. And I have just seen that if you give people the opportunity to speak from their heart, they are so anxious and committed to doing that. And so if you can work into anything that you might be structuring, as a ceremonial moment where suddenly it gets very real and everybody there, drops into that real space, then at the end of it, there's a really deep feeling of satisfaction, like that
Mm.
was really cool. Can we do that again? Something like that
Yeah.
again. And a lot of it is, it's like, ceremony or anything dealing with that. It should, it should be choreographed in a certain way. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. And it's like, don't forget the end. Don't forget the closure at the end, the completion. It's easy to get caught up in the middle of it and have the energy, just disperse, but I sometimes I did a talk a number of years ago at the consciousness forum that Bill Linton puts on every
Mhm.
year at the USONA. And I did an hour talk, and most of the first half of the talk was about Burning Man as a large scale initiation.
Yes.
So that, you start to prepare, you're going, to go off and do this thing. You've never been there before. It's a big deal. You want to, have everything together to go. You go there, you cross you go over the threshold, classic, initiation. You
Hmm.
cross the threshold into this new space. Um, that has things like leave no trace. You enter through the gate of the playa and you find yourself out on the playa, and now you're in like the liminal phase of initiation where you're in an unknown place. You're betwixt and between the worlds. Your old world is like way back wherever you've come from. You're out on this salt flat, and there's incredible art and all kinds of magical, wonderful, terrifying, all kinds of things happening. There's no money. And in the early days, had to barter, but now it's like more of a giveaway economy, of people sharing things. And that space has been a big initiatory, space for thousands and thousands of people, oftentimes for the first time, like with psychedelics as well.
Hmm.
And and then when it's over, you cross back over the threshold and back into, integrating, what that was that you experienced. And I think it's, and it's it's a very beautiful example of what large scale initiation looks like, in terms of the modern world. And people go away forever changed by their experience at Burning Man, either by the beauty of the art or by their encounters with other people, the freedom that people are, inhabiting, they're out on the playa. They leave there, changed by it. And they often, like the Eleusinian mystery, they want to go back next year and do it all over again. So, and it has an element of ordeal. The Burning Man it's not easy out there on the playa, and the dust storms arrive and the wind and the rain and, who knows what, so it was such a great way to try to explain, what large scale initiation could look like, actually does look like.
Well, that's a perfect example because it's a identifiable cultural example. And when you think about the just daily practice, here people are primarily, as you referenced earlier, overwhelmed by digital distractions, not able to actually follow their own thinking because we just are constantly, having other values and directives kind of take our attention. How do you recommend people start or return to sacred relationship?
I think you begin by inhabiting your place, wherever that is. How do you know where your water comes from? How do you understand what farm to table eating might be? Do what does it mean to live inside your own little ecosystem? Where's your garbage going? I think those are pretty basic kind of, environmental, realities, and understanding who are the people who were here before we were here. What is this place? Who inhabited this place before us? Where are the ancestors here? Who are our ancestors here? I think those are all, really good questions. And, how do you develop a sense of place so that you feel connected to the land that you're on? You feel connected to the larger community and the needs of the community and the, needs of the reality of living in whatever kind of ecosystem, whether it's urban or desert or, forest or mountains. And then, how do you start to, we have such a frontier mentality, we're kind of just passing through, right?
Yeah.
We're just passing through. But, if we start to pay attention to where we are and, in that indigenous viewpoint, how do we start to think 7 generations into the future, rather than just thinking about today?
I just notice how, a lot of these things are exceptionally difficult because, and I get back to, see earlier notes where I'll project here, certainly mine, but many people I know, their communities are not oriented in this way. We see things, you referenced it once, these gods we worship of commerce, economic pragmatism is one of the lines you used,
Yeah,
that we worship this deity and we don't realize we're worshiping a false idol in the process.
right.
And so I feel that lament that I mentioned earlier in your book about it really is having to forge a path. And if you think it's just going to be there and easy because the culture's laid it out, it's not. It's hard. It takes a lot of effort to unhook from these currents of disconnection and distraction that we're so inundated with and reconnect with something inspirited. And so I just think a moment of recognition for anybody listening, certainly myself feeling that of, wow, God, I like that. Who has time for that? That's the expression that I hear so many people say is, I don't have time for that. I got to do this, that, and the other, and all kinds of valid and important priorities.
I think, sometimes just, really simple, have a men's group,
Yeah.
have a women's group. Think about, equinoxes and solstices and
Yes.
full moons, and
Yeah.
gather people together and create something fun and meaningful,
Mm.
and have food at the end. And there should be it should be fun. There should be conviviality, with it, and a collective rather than like one person being the leader.
Uh-huh.
Move that around, and on the next equinox, have the other person host and facilitate and create, or maybe a collective part of the group goes, okay, let's do this next time,
Mhm.
and enjoy the process of being creative, and yet finding a way to have some really meaningful depth in
Uh-huh.
in that liminal phase of the gathering. We know how to have a party, so it's a little more, focused, and it still can be a party,
Yeah.
afterwards. And I think, it's a beginning of those equinox, solstice, full moon, the men's group, women's group, bringing the men and the women together. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can evolve, out of it. But, even just a once a month gathering of people together, and maybe it's the men and the women,
Mhm.
where something meaningful takes place that's still fun, but also meaningful, and finding a way to figure out, what works. And do you want to burn some sage, or burn, some incense, and have some kind of, an idea of like, we're crossing a threshold right now. This means that we're changing gears. We're
Mhm.
dropping into a deeper space right now. And then whatever that deeper space might be, sometimes it's writing. It's New Year's Eve. How can you make New Year's Eve a little more meaningful? Well, people always want to take some kind of vow, or get rid of something. So have a fire, have something, have people write it down on a piece, simple things, writing down whatever they want to get rid of, or what they want to call in for the new year. But people bear witness to that,
Uh-huh.
and then everybody feels like, oh, that was so much better than just like drinking and singing Old Lang Syne, at midnight, of creating a way that it becomes a sacred moment. We do a little candle lighting ceremony between Christmas and New Year's, where we start off in a dark room, and people go up and they light the candle of what they want to call in for a new year. It just gets profound, and suddenly people are crying, and it doesn't take much. I feel by nature, we long for a sense of the
Mhm.
sacred, and something that's kind of real and connected, and with people we either know or we get to know as a result, like, oh, you were here last year, or you were here last full moon, and relationships develop, out of it. Community develops, and then you see, what maybe there's things that you want to take on as a community around, where you live, and how you're living, and what's happening locally. Michael likes to say, be famous 5 minutes from where you live,
That's good.
and, and that's pretty good.
Well, I liked your answer about I started doing this. I started fasting every full moon, and if I mean, it does a lot of things, but if anything, what it does is it connects me with a cycle that's not this one,
Yeah.
And so there's a different orientation, and so I think at baseline, I notice myself paying attention to the moon in a way. It's like, oh yeah, it's getting closer, and so I and it's not excruciating. I mean, I like it's a 24-hour fast, but that practice isn't done very often. And if anything, I've always been a little envious of one of my friends in particular, James. Yeah, he's a priest, and I've always said to him, I'm like, man, you get to live by the cycles, right? You've got a calendar and the seasons and your community, and you're changing your robes, and you're oriented to the cycles and the season.
Right.
And so many of us aren't in systems that participate in natural cycles in that way.
Right, right. And but that it's such an easy thing to do, whether
Totally.
you're in an apartment on the 18th floor in Manhattan or, in the countryside to call friends together and have a full moon
Yes.
something, a full
Yeah.
moon ceremony, a full moon gathering, whatever. And I think, there's so many elements of ceremony that are like easily incorporated, and people do it spontaneously, when there's a mass shooting or a community death, the way people just bring flowers and they
Mhm.
create altars and uh, the impulse is like so there and nobody's telling them to do that. It's just comes out of the human spirit to want to make that sacred, make that place a sacred spot right now
Yeah.
because something happened there.
You mentioned that about I forget the exact references you've had, but the again, it has to do with embarrassment. People kind of keeping their spiritual, quote, spiritual impulses or inclinations a bit hidden. And yet, spontaneously, we're not even conscious of the ways that we have all these communal opportunities with mystery.
Yes.
Why do you take flowers there? We do it. And that's what's mind blowing to me so often is that we are religious beings, and we've just misunderstood spirit, religion, what religion really is at its core, not just an organized structure, but a real reconnection and communion with the great mystery.
Right, and none of these kinds of activities need to like take away from organized religion
Right.
or, having that connection. But I think, we can just go deeper, in terms of the human to human. And like I said, as if you're gathered in a circle with people and you give them the opportunity to talk from their heart, they are so ready,
Ready. Yeah.
ready to do that,
Mhm.
and sometimes too ready, and you have to have a timekeeper
Yes.
on it,
Well, I like that you talked a lot about the talking stick. It's like you got to have a bell, like, hey, let's respect the community. Yes.
Right, and, but it indicates just, that, and we love bearing witness to one another, and we love realizing that everybody's story is our story,
Hmm.
even if we've not experienced that same thing. There's that place, where we can drop into that empathetic, compassionate place where we can feel that. I can live that in that moment when I hear you talk about that, and
Hmm.
it evokes compassion and love, and now I know you, there's just this human exchange that happens there.
So, what's something you've unlearned? Well, you had to unlearn through this process of holding ceremonial space.
Something unlearned. Um, know the difference between when you're in ceremony with your community and you're not in ceremony with your
Mm.
community. And if you're facilitating ceremony or you're in the position of, being a guide or a leader or whatever, know how to step back into just being a member of the community
Mm.
when you're not
Hmm.
in that role.
I think a lot of psychotherapists need to learn that.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And even ceremonial leaders and whatnot,
Yeah.
and
That's
it's like,
wise.
okay, that's a sacred space and you maybe have a role or maybe there's other, officers or whatever in conducting certain things. And then, how do you just go back into being like part of the community again?
Mm.
And allow the community to allow you that too. Like in your own, probably position in your
Mm.
community. It's like, yeah, I just want to be one of the guys right now.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
I don't want to be the wise, elder at the moment, and
Well, I think one of the ways I get through that's is teaching a process, not teaching the process doesn't exempt you from being beholden to the inevitabilities of what visits us throughout our lives.
right, yeah.
That's just the cost of doing business.
Yeah, exactly, and I think one of the points on that medicine wheel that I talked about earlier is also humor. And I think any kind of process that we're doing, with people, I think not to for it to be we I think because of religious backgrounds, we think that ceremony it should be very solemn and serious,
Mhm.
and that one of the things that I learned from the Huichol Indians is humor is really, really a big part of it, and that the ability to laugh and feel all the emotions when you're in ceremonial space or psychedelic space, to be
Mhm.
able to laugh, to be able to cry, it's all part of it. It's all essential. There is no doing it wrong.
Mhm.
There's, Leo Zeff, who was like the secret chief, who taught so many people about how to like hold space for people
Yeah.
in psychedelic. He would always tell people right before giving them medicine, just remember you can't mess this up, you know?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. There, whatever is going to happen will be just what's needed.
It's
So,
beautiful.
get rid of the expectations and even the intention,
Mhm. Yeah, yes. Intention is always funny to me. I'm like, that's
good luck.
yeah.
I
Best of
always
intentions, yeah.
we always go back to Forrest Gump. Hey, it's a box of chocolates.
Whatever.
You never know
Yeah.
what you're going to get,
No,
and
predictable. Yes.
and
Well, I was asking earlier about unlearning and just curious about, since writing the book, of course, how has your understanding of ceremony and sacred space changed, and what have you learned through being in process?
oh boy, I would say, especially so much of whether it's psychedelics or community events, community ceremony. It's like, how do you create a container? How do you create a space so that everybody recognizes that we are we are in a safe container here together, and we go about very consciously creating that. And that can be with different people, in the community, calling in different energies, it
Mhm.
can be the four directions, it can be, different aspects of the self, but it's an acknowledgement that, you know, we're calling in from outside guidance and guides, and whether it's ancestors or whatever we want it to be, but that we're making the space that we're in a safe space for everyone to be and everyone to be
Mhm.
themselves, and that inside this container, all is welcome, here. And then at the end we want to, open that space back up. We want to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. pretty, it's pretty basic,
Mm-hmm.
in that regard. But I think, finding ways to do that. It can be with a song or somebody playing the guitar, or, now we're entering into that, and we're going to all be safe here to express ourselves, or to
Mm-hmm.
let go of things, or to burn things, or to break things. Maybe we're all given something to break that represents a letting go of whatever it might be. And we can, you know, create, symbolic. We haven't really touched on that, but the human mind is very receptive to, the symbolic acts, and
Mm-hmm.
ways of bringing symbolic acts into events or ceremonies or gatherings of and using those things to represent energies that we might want to be calling in, or expressing, or if somebody has died, or an initiation for a young boy, or a girl. There's so many ways to be creative, in the process of this, that and can be so simple and yet so meaningful for people.
Mm-hmm.
People, respond to it, and
Mm-hmm.
like I said, they want to do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Let's do that again.
yeah. Right.
So it just in beginning to close, I'm curious about stories. You kind of mentioned that we hadn't touched on the symbolic, but I'm curious what we have not touched on, and maybe two questions: what haven't we touched on, and also what stories are there that maybe you remember or recall as we're talking that you'd like to share?
Mm. Oh boy. Yeah, I think one of my favorite ceremonies, and I do talk about it in the book, is the Balinese ceremony of Nepe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't know if you remember that or not, but
I do.
once a year they make these big floats and big effigies, and that night they gather at the crossroads, which is another, you can find images of the crossroads in Greece, and culturally, gathering at the crossroads is symbolic. And they burn the effigies, and they clang and they bang on, with instruments and whatnot. And then the whole island goes silent. And
It's amazing.
uh, it's so amazing.
Yeah.
And you stay indoors. You're not allowed to be on your motorbike. There's no taxis at the airport. And for the next, it's like 36 hours till the next night, and the following morning it picks up again. But the idea is that anything mechanical will attract what they perceive as being the demons. And so on this day of silence, this period of silence, and the clanging and the banging at the beginning is to drive all of that energy off of the island, and to not use anything mechanical, so that it doesn't attract this like negative energy. And oh my God, I've been there a couple of times for that ceremony, and it's one of those ceremonies that you think, wouldn't it be wonderful if, like, the whole planet, if we just took a day of deep silence,
Yeah.
and stopped everything, unplug the refrigerator, I mean, like, everything mechanical, just like the underlying buzz of the modern world,
Wow.
just takes a break for 24 hours, and we can imagine some kind of freeing of energy, and then we can start up again,
Mm.
and go back to that being plugged in.
Thank you for that. Kind of an unimaginable,
Yeah, yeah, it
but
is.
just it is in my mind. I think I said this recently. I can't remember if it was on the last interview or not, but we had an experience close to that in COVID, where the
Yes.
world collectively shuts, but and then all of a sudden you hear that the whales are singing, and the dolphins are like back. It's like, oh my gosh, the world kind of became animated when we shut up.
Yes, it did, and rivers ran cleaner, and all kinds of things happened,
Yeah.
and I do think that was a very interesting collective experience,
Yeah.
and it can be critiqued in all kinds of ways, and whatnot. But as a global experience, I did feel like it was pretty profound, profound moment for all of us, and a time to, like, kind of take ourselves to task around all kinds of things. And I think, hopefully we all learned something, in that experience. And
I hope so. I don't.
yeah.
I think that the gods of commerce are strong.
Yeah, they are. They definitely are.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and who knows where we're going, I don't think we're going to Mars anytime soon. I
Yeah.
will just put that in there. And I think we're so lucky to live on this incredible
Oh,
planet that we have. And I really do hope that we find a way to take better care of it. And especially as we see larger and more devastating, natural disasters, occurring. And it's so heartbreaking what's happened in Texas there with the Camp Mystic, and
yeah.
so many thousands of people who are impacted by that, and beyond, into other parts of the world. And I just want to say it's the kind of thing that happens a lot in other places, and
Yeah.
has, and we're so used to, well, it doesn't happen here,
Hmm.
but you know what? It is happening here.
Hmm.
And I hope that, in the years and decades ahead, that we collectively have more of that awareness, that we can, pay attention to, and realize that there may be changes that we all need to make in our lives going forward, and paying more attention to all aspects of us and the collective and the natural world, and what we want to leave to the children and the future generations going forward.
Yeah, it reminds me of something you wrote about. You were writing about somebody that follows the one rule of indigenous wisdom, which is never do anything that ends the life of the tribe, and went on to say not to pollute the waters and not to
Mm.
offend other people, not to hurt your friends and family and neighbors. And we would all be well served to embody that.
And it's like those stone tablets that came off the mountain, it was all there too, right? The Ten Commandments,
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
you know,
That too. Oh, that one. Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Just live that. Sure.
that too, pretty
Well,
basic,
basic. Well, Adele,
basic.
is there anything else that we're leaving, or what else? Just kind of is hanging. What threads are lingering?
No, I just want to thank you for
Oh,
inviting me to have this conversation with you, and thank you for reading this
it's
book that
outstanding.
I have vague memories of writing, and thinking, wow, really? I said that? How nice. And yeah, I just wish the best for us as a species, and all the other species going forward,
Mm.
and us as spiritual beings. And I include people who are atheists in this too. That's one of the beauties of, I think, ceremony and ideas of the sacred, that you can find ways to language any of
Mm.
this
Mhm.
that is palatable to us as human beings. And I would encourage us to do that.
Mm. Thank you. And where can people find you?
Oh, liminafoundation.org.
Check it
They
out.
can find us there. And we are doing, a big event in Santa Fe on September 7th. Can I do a
Of
shameless
course.
plug for
Please
that?
plug
Um,
away.
we had the good fortune here in New Mexico to be the first state to pass SB 219, which is a organic psilocybin bill for mental health and diagnosable illnesses. And we have 2 years to implement it and begin serving, communities who need that kind of service in New Mexico. We're the first state to do it as a legislative process and have the governor sign it into law. It costs $0 to do that. We did not spend millions of dollars trying to make this happen.
Wow.
It's pretty incredible.
It is.
And we are putting on an event September 7th called The Enchanted State. We are the land of enchantment, and the event is The Enchanted State with a wonderful list of experts in the field and researchers and veterans and indigenous people and film and a big educational celebration in Santa Fe at that time. So you can find out more information at liminafoundation.org.
Yeah, just look below in the show notes. I'll have a link to it.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Persuade